My name is Barry. I'm Federal Secretary of Socialist Action and a co-editor of Socialist Action newspaper, which I hope you've seen. You'll be invited to buy a copy before you leave, I'm sure. This is the first of three lectures, three presentations with the accent on discussion. We call it Socialism in the Park. There'll be talks by three leaders of our party, Socialist Action, over the next 2 weeks after tonight. And each presentation will be followed by questions, answers, and discussion. The first presentation is the origins of class and the state. And if you want to pick up some very relevant reading material, there's a booklet on the table there under the tent titled The Marxist Theory of the State. And that's quite a bit of the content of tonight's lecture, so I invite you to pick that up before you leave. And we'll be back here next Wednesday and the Wednesday after, and I'll talk about those topics after the main presentation. The presentation will be about 40 minutes? Yeah, about 35, 40 minutes, after which there'll be some announcements, which I'll make, and you can make some too, if you wish, about upcoming events in the city. And then we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. So I hope you enjoy it. You're in for a real treat. The Origins of Class and the State, with a terrific presentation by Mitchell Shore, who is a member of the Socialist Action leadership. Here you are.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me okay. So as Barry said, I'm going to be discussing tonight the origins of class and the state. I'll get started. So it is obscene because even as the world economic growth has slowed, the rich have managed to gain a greater slice of the world's wealth. Last year in the United States, the richest 1% effectively shifted nearly $4 trillion in wealth away from the rest of the nation to themselves. Nearly half of that transferred wealth came from the nation's most impoverished people. Closer to home, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives just released a report that shows that last year, the richest 1% of Torontonians saw a raise worth twice as much as the minimum wage earner would make in an entire year. That's even after the minimum wage hike of $15 in 2019. Isn't this absurd? It's crazy. How can so few people have so much of the world's wealth? The point is that economic inequality, worldwide economic inequality, is the great concern of our age. Inequality of revenue and wealth is not only an economic fact, but sadly, it has very real-life implications. This is especially true on how it influences the chances of survival and death. And this is not a joke. Yet most people turn a blind eye to the unjust tax havens. They turn away from the tax breaks and ignore other advantages designed specifically to benefit the rich. They ignore the increasing privatization of everything around us, the scaling back of wages that workers have made, the rise of poverty-level wages, mass indebtedness, of homelessness, the war on immigrant workers, escalating police violence, environmental degradation, and the extremely dire conditions in which Indigenous people, both on and off reserves, find themselves. And what is the result? The result is massive concentration of wealth. Wealth is much more concentrated than ever, and as you will see, with wealth comes power. So, why is this the case? Was it always so? Is inequality simply a function of human nature? The short answer is no. As Karl Marx argued, there is no such thing as human nature. Rather, as society changes, so do people's beliefs, desires, and abilities. The way people live cannot be separated from the society in which they live. So in order to understand how people behave, we must first look at the history of changing social relations. The thing we call history actually only covers a short period of human life. Prehistory, the time before writing and civilization, spans millions of years. During most of prehistoric human existence, class inequality was unknown to humanity. Modern anthropologists studied surviving prehistoric peoples. Margaret Mead and others, for instance, have described the feasts of the Polynesian people. Polynesians gathered together to consume the surplus of their harvest so that no one was able to accumulate the riches. Further research shows that when exclusive reliance on hunting and gathering gave way to agriculture, each family worked for a piece of land for a given period of time. After that, the use of the fields was rotated and to avoid favoring any member of a community. Pastures and woods, for instance, were also used in common. Society was not yet divided into classes. The idea that social inequality is rooted in the inequality of individual talents or the product of innate egoism or human nature has no scientific basis. The exploitation of one class by another is the product of historical evolution of society and not of human nature. There have not always been rich and poor people, and, as we hope, there will not always be. Before the class division of society first appeared, humanity lived in a state of clan or tribal communism. Nostalgia for the ancient community way of life is expressed in the dreams of the Golden Age, a dream described by classical Chinese, Greek, and Latin authors. Virgil, for instance, explicitly states that during the Golden Age, harvests were shared in common. This implies that private property did not exist. Many famous philosophers and scholars also saw the source of the society's ills as class division, and they proposed ways to replace it. Plato described a state of war between the poor and rich parts of town. Jewish sects and founders of the Christian church urged a return to the community of goods. St. John was the first to say property is theft, and Augustine, at first, saw that the origin of social strife was violence, social strife and violence was private property. And this continued through the Middle Ages with Sir Francis of Assisi and later in the Reformation. Finally, we see the outlines of these projects in Thomas More's Utopia and Campanella's The City of the Sun, and on and on and on. Alongside these spiritual and philosophical revolts, there were also countless actual revolts. That is, insurrections of oppressed classes against their oppressors. Again, as Marx showed us, the history of all class societies is the history of class struggles that tear them apart. Which is to say, that as society moves from one stage to the other, the dominant class is removed by a new emerging class, and by overthrowing the political shell that enforces the old relations of production. This new class makes way for new productive forces. These class struggles take a variety of forms. In China, innumerable peasant uprisings marked the history of the successive dynasties that ruled the empire. In ancient Greece and Rome, there were continual slave revolts. The most well-known was led by Spartacus, and this, of course, led to the collapse of the Roman Empire. And among the free citizens, there were violent struggles between the indebted peasants and merchants, between those who had property and those who did not. In the Middle Ages, class struggle set feudal lords against the small free commodity-producing communities. The most savage class struggles were those between feudal nobility and the peasantry, trying to throw off their feudal yoke. These took the revolutionary form in the War of Wat Taylor in England, the Jacqueries in France, the Hussites in Bohemia, and the Peasant War in the 16th century. History between the 16th and 18th centuries is marked by class struggles between the nobility and the bourgeoisie, between the bankers and traders on one side and the unskilled laborers on the other. These struggles heralded the bourgeois revolutions and modern capitalism. It also marked the beginnings of class struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. So let's return to the question, what are the economic sources of inequality? Prehistoric humanity lived in conditions of extreme poverty. People obtained the food necessary for existence by hunting and gathering. Humanity could not increase or control the natural resources it needed to survive. Everyone had to work. Everyone's labor was necessary to keep the community alive. Granting material privileges to one part of the tribe would condemn another part to famine. That is why, at this stage of history, social organization leaned toward maximum equality. Only the development of techniques of agriculture and farming changed this situation of extreme poverty. The development of agriculture was the greatest economic revolution ever, and it was, by the way, along with pottery and weaving, attributable to women. This started to take place around 15,000 BC in Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, Iran, Turkestan, and gradually progressed into Egypt, India, China, North Africa, and eventually Europe. This period was known as the Neolithic Revolution, the final part of the Stone Age. It was a time when tools were made of polished stone, tools which allowed humanity to produce its own food. It reduced dependence on the forces of nature and permitted the building up of food reserves. This in turn released certain members of the community from the need to produce their own food, and as a result, certain divisions of labor could occur, essentially a specialization of jobs, which of course increased the productivity of labor. With the appearance of a large and permanent surplus of food, primitive social organization was overturned. Once the surpluses were concentrated over large areas, they introduced the conditions that created social inequality. Also, the surpluses could now be used to feed prisoners captured in war. So instead of simply being killed, prisoners could be compelled to work for food, which was how slavery began in ancient Greece. The same surplus could also be used to feed the priests, the lords, and the kings. And this is how the ruling classes appeared in Egypt, Babylon, Iran, India, China, and so on. So, a social division of labor completes the economic division of labor, essentially the specialization of productive skills. Social production is now divided into two parts, the necessary product and the social surplus product. The necessary product is a means of subsistence created by the producers, and without this labor, society would collapse. The social surplus product, that is the surplus produced by the laborers, was seized by the owning classes, and that is the priests, the lords, nobles, and their officials. The appearance of distinct and antagonistic social classes, the productive classes and ruling classes, gives birth to the state. The state is the principal institution which maintains given social conditions, which, as we have seen, is the enforcement of social inequality. The division of society into classes is completed by the seizure of the means of production by the owning classes. The seizure of social surplus. Just stand there, Julius. The seizure of social production, social surplus by one part of society is the result of social struggle, and it is only maintained by a constant social struggle. At the same time, it represents a key stage in economic process. It separates two basic economic functions, production and accumulation. Accumulation allows for part of humanity to have enough leisure time, this is important, leisure time to stockpile tools, to learn complicated techniques, and to systematically observe natural phenomena. This helps to increase the social productivity of labor. Now, these leisure time activities are key to civilization. They are key to the development of important things like astronomy, geometry, mineralogy, and of course writing. So this brings us to another question. Why have all past egalitarian revolutions failed? Why? The shortish answer is this. As long as the surplus is not sufficient enough to liberate the whole of humanity from drudgery, then any social revolution which tries to re-establish equality is condemned to failure. So at this point it can go in one of two ways. It can destroy the social surplus, that is the surplus produced by the laborers, and return society to extreme poverty. But in this case, there will inevitably be a reappearance of the technical and economic progress, which would once again give rise to social economic inequality. Or, on the other hand, it can totally remove the ways of old owning classes in the favor of a new one. This is essentially a social revolution. So an egalitarian society based on abundance and not poverty, essentially the aim of socialism, can be developed only on the basis of an advanced economy. An economy in which the social surplus is very high. So high that it can free all the producers from drudgery and provide enough leisure time for everyone to be able to fill the managerial tasks of the economic the managerial tasks of economic, social, and political life. So why has it taken over 15,000 years for this to happen? Why has it taken so long for humanity to achieve this, achieve enough development of production to allow for a socialist revolution, a solution to worldwide inequality? Well, here's why. Because as long as the owning classes accumulate wealth, they consume it for themselves. The ancient kings and slave masters and later the feudal nobles had no interest in increasing production once they had filled their palaces with luxury items. There were limits to how much the rulers could consume. Only when the social surplus takes the form of money, what Marx called surplus value, and then it buys not only consumer goods, but also the means of production, a new ruling class, the bourgeoisie, becomes interested in the unlimited growth of production. Then all scientific discoveries can be applied to production. And only then do the conditions exist that give rise to modern industrial capitalism. So this brings us back to the role of the state. You see, in primitive communist societies, administrative functions were carried out by all members of the tribe. Everyone carried arms and took part in decision making. There was no community. There was a community. There was a collective. There was no state. The state is born when these functions were seized by a separate group of people. An army was formed, which was distinct from the mass of citizens who used to be armed. Judges replaced the general assemblies in judging their equals. Kings and queens took the place of temporary leaders who used to be elected by the collective. Priests, clerks, teachers, and philosophers were also set apart from the rest of the community. So the birth of the state is the result of two changes. First, a permanent social surplus, which allowed the birth of the state is the result of two changes. First, a permanent social surplus, which allows part of society to specialize in accumulative and administrative functions, and a second, at the same time, it allows the new elite to exclude the rest of community from political functions, which before had been everyone's business, everyone's role. Everyone had a right to participate. So exclusion of the many means profit for a few. The new rulers excluded the exploited and the productive classes from those functions which would allow them to end their exploitation. The owning classes could now use the new armies to help them extract taxes and force labor. Groups of armed men could force farmers and cattle breeders, and later artisans and merchants, to give up part of the production for the benefit of the ruling classes. To this end, they carry arms and develop laws to prevent the producers themselves from being armed. Friedrich Engels described the state as a body of armed men. Of course, there's more to it than that, but in the end, it really is the coercive role of the state that defines it. The state works on behalf of one section of society and pits it against the rest. It allows the ruling classes to keep taking social surplus. It allows the members of the state apparatus to be paid. And of course, the bigger the surplus, the bigger the state. To reduce the need for constant, violent coercion, the owning classes use the state to convince the exploited classes that power and privileges of the minority are inevitable, permanent, and just. You see, the state not only has a repressive function, but an ideological one too. Humanity survives by social labor, which implies social relations between people. This requires communication, language, and leads to the development of consciousness, reflection, and the production of ideas. Most of us think with the help of ideas which we learned in school or in church, or with ideas borrowed from TV, from radio, advertising, newspapers, and most recently the internet. This current production of ideas and systems of ideas is called ideology. Ideology is limited and shaped by a small minority in society, a minority who monopolize the means of communication. In every class, the dominant ideology is that of the dominant class. In class society, the dominant ideology is that of the dominant class. In the Middle Ages, poets, painters, and philosophers were maintained by the nobility and the church. Later, merchants and rich bankers appeared as patrons of the arts. The arrival of capitalism allowed ideological producers to produce their work in an open market. However, typically, the only buyers were the capitalists and the bourgeois state behind them. Whatever the dominant ideology, its role is to maintain the status quo. In other words, class rule. It is clear that the ideological power of the ruling class is inseparable from economic and political power. The economically dominant class is also the ruling class. That is, the class which controls the means of production also controls the state. The renowned Marxist Antonio Gramsci showed us how mass culture has always been a dangerous counter-revolutionary force. It creates a herd mentality that shuns independent thought. It destroys self-confidence and marginalizes and discredits nonconformists. It depoliticizes the citizenry. It instills a sense of collective futility and impotence. It presents the ruling ideology as the revealed truth. It presents it as an inevitable force that alone makes human progress possible. Mass culture is an assault, as Gramsci wrote, that results in a confused and fragmentary consciousness. It is designed to impart the belief in working people that their true interests are aligned with those of the global ruling class. And in our case today, that would be global capitalism. Although the ideas of the ruling class are dominant, they are not alone. There are the ideas of a new revolutionary class which is emerging. A class which has begun the fight for its own emancipation. It is a class which must first free itself from the ideas of the oppressors before it can throw off oppression itself. The more stable a class society, the less the class struggle challenges will be. Now, that is, the system itself will not be challenged. But the more economic and social stability there is, the more class struggle will develop, and develop to a point of posing questions of overthrowing the system. That is the task of a social revolution. A social revolution breaks out when the exploited and oppressed classes no longer accept their domination by the ruling class. It is when they no longer accept that their situation is inevitable, permanent, and just. It is when they are no longer intimidated and no longer accept the ruler's ideology. It is when they put together the materials and moral forces needed to overthrow the ruling class. A social revolution occurs when the existing mode of production becomes an obstacle or a barrier to the continued development of the productive forces and the overall wealth of society. A social revolution replaces the rule of one class for that of another. It removes the previous ruling class from state power. Every social revolution is accompanied by a political revolution, but not every political revolution is a social revolution. So what do I mean by that? For example, the English Parliament destroyed the absolutism of Charles I during the English Revolution in 1649. Similarly, the American Congress destroyed the domination of George III over the 13 colonies. And the French Revolution of 1789 destroyed the power of the Bourbon monarchy. However, the French Revolutions of 1830, of 1848, and 1870 put in power different forms of government, which, however, belonged to the same social class, the bourgeoisie. Political revolutions resolve conflicts inside the same class, but they do not change the mode of production. Unlike the feudal state, which is subordinate to the interests of an absolute monarch, the capitalist state must advance the interests of competing capitalists. This requires the stable conditions of law, of security for every capitalist, a unified national market, and monetary systems and certain international rules. These things are created by the bourgeois state. When the bourgeoisie is doing well, it tends to reduce the economic functions of the state to a minimum. But when the bourgeois is weak and in decline, the state tries to extend these functions to guarantee their private profit. So our socialist objective is the replacement of a bourgeois society with a classless society, a community where people come before profit, where social solidarity replaces the search for individual wealth, and where the wealth of society assures the harmonious development of all individuals. It becomes a society, as Karl Marx envisioned, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, where it becomes possible to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, to fish in the afternoon, to rear cattle in the evening, to criticize after dinner, without ever becoming a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critic. A society where labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. Now, before concluding, I just want to say a few words about modern Canada. Canada was founded as a colonial settler state. It began as a state which expropriated and nearly exterminated Indigenous people. It conquered and subordinated French settlers. Canada today is an imperialist state. Canada's economic elite export capital and exploit labor abroad as well as at home. It is a state that denies the right of self-determination to oppressed nations within our own borders. It serves, it protects, and upholds the dominance of a really existing Canadian capitalist class. In global terms, it is a junior partner to the American capitalist class. But here in Canada, big business runs its own state. It employs its own generously funded political parties and exercises control through the larger apparatus of bourgeois, civil, judicial, and military institutions. So that is why when we say that even the most liberal capitalist democracies in the world, wherever they may be, are nothing more than minority rule. They are at best a dollar democracy. But is this really the best that humankind can create? Should we really, as a people, with our astonishing history of social and technological innovations, accept the capitalist market as the peak of human development? Well, I, for one, don't believe that for 1 second. And I'm sure you don't either. What I do believe, however, and I honestly believe this, is that only by working together, by uniting working men and women in the struggle against the capitalist system, we can bring about real fundamental change. It will not be easy, but it is possible. So I urge you to join with us. Join us in our fight against the capitalist pirates. Join us in our struggles against war and imperialism, in our battles against all forms of oppression and against environmental destruction. Join us as we fight for real, meaningful socialist change. Join socialist action today, because only a working class socialist revolution can bring about a majority rule. Only a socialist revolution can bring about a just society, and only a socialist revolution can bring about a better world. Thank you.
Terrific. Wasn't that terrific? Let's hear it again from Mitchell Short.
Distractions.
Yes, we had some competition from the sports field, but it's all in good fun. I'm going to follow your example and sit here. Mitchell had the minor task of explaining about 20,000 years of human history. But now that you know how the world works, you're ready for action. Well, maybe you have some questions and some comments. But before I open the floor to questions and comments, I'm going to make a few announcements. Socialist Action is a